Chris, welcome to the Load Research chapter. We hope to see more of you in future. Folks, just some background from Chris's side. I had a bit of a chat with him earlier on today. Chris is currently busy with his MSc at Stellenbosch University, where his current research project is to investigate impact of adopting electric vehicles into informal public transport systems of developing countries. Chris has made such good progress there that he's on his way to upgrading to a PhD. So keep eyes on this man for the future. The interesting thing that struck me with Chris's approach, which he's going to describe to you with the evaluation of the adoption of minibus taxis, is the techniques that have been used here. And personally, I can't wait to hear these verbalized, because the same techniques can be used to enable our understanding of various kind of renewables at both a household and a business level, if we have the end use information available. So, Chris, I hope I haven't broken your introduction too much, but what I would really like to see is where this might go, further into the future. The big issue is the high costs of electric vehicles and the practicality of them in the African context. Okay, Chris, would you like to take over? The floor is yours.
100%. Thanks, Marcus, for the lovely introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I'd like to start asking you to raise your hands on Teams if you've ever ridden in an electric vehicle. Post on the chat what vehicle it was, whether it be a go-kart or whatever it is, or whatever brand it was, just post it there. I hope you've all had that experience. While you're busy raising your hands or typing on the chat, I'd like to tell you a short story. When I was studying in undergrad, I used to take in a competition called the Shell Eco Marathon. Maybe some of you have heard of it, but I hope you can see the picture here. It's basically a competition, a student competition where you build a car that can go as far as possible using as little energy as possible. So in 2018, we brought this petrol vehicle, which we built, and we got 180 kilometers per liter as our mileage. And we came first in the petrol category. It was an amazing experience. But in the following year, we decided to take a risk and try switch from petrol to electricity. And hopefully, we were hoping to come first in the electric category. And that was my task as my final year project, to convert this student-built car from petrol to electric. So this is how the original petrol transmission looked like. It was just bolted down to the chassis with 4 bolts. And this is the one that I created as my final year project, so we could swap between the electric and petrol very easily. Just unscrew the one and screw in the other one. So our plan was to participate in the Shell Eco Marathon, but in both categories, petrol and electric, and just swap out the transmission when we want to participate in the other category, and hopefully win both categories in the competition. Unfortunately, the event got cancelled that year in 2019 due to the xenophobic attacks that were happening in Joburg. So we decided to just test the electric car at our nearby racetrack, and we obtained a mileage of 240 kilometers per kilowatt hour. I don't know, a kilowatt hour is like 2 rand. So 240 kilometers on just 2 rand of electricity. And that was an amazing achievement. It was the highlight, I would say the highlight of my undergraduate. But from that day onwards, I realized that transport could be so much different to what we're used to. And I decided from that day to dedicate my career to improving the way that we think about vehicles and transport. So yeah, let me quickly see what electric vehicles you have driven and who has driven. an electric vehicle. Let me just see. Okay, so I'm pulling out teams here. Okay, Marcus has ridden a golf cart, electric scooter, old trolley buses in Pretoria. Interesting. So I'm surprised nobody's driven an electric, like a passenger vehicle, sedan or anything like that. But these are very non-conventional vehicles, and yeah, I can say the same for myself, because my experience of driving an electric vehicle was this car right over here, the one that we built, and certainly not conventional. But unfortunately, okay, so a vehicle like this, by the way, I told you it was 240 kilometers per kilowatt hour. If you compare that to a Tesla, like a normal electric vehicle sedan, that's around that a vehicle like that would go only 10 kilometers on a kilowatt hour. But of course, unfortunately, not everyone can drive an exotic vehicle like this or a golf cart, or it's not feasible to use that for normal transport. I mean, this was made of carbon fiber, had zero suspension, and only seated one person, but it was extremely energy efficient. So with all these various types of transportation in mind, the real question is, what is the best type of electric vehicle for our future? Would it be something like the Tesla, like a typical sedan, or the eco car, this car that we built, an electric trolley bus, like somebody had mentioned, go-kart, whatever it could be? The real question is, how will our future look like? I'll start by looking at the present. This is what the present looks like. I'll give you a moment to look at this, to read this comic. And yeah, it's a pretty bleak situation. But now, in this comic, just substitute the word bus with taxi, because taxis are what we use here in Africa. Now, we've tried many solutions in the past, like bus and train and trolley bus, as somebody had mentioned, but oftentimes they struggle to meet the needs of the poor and operate at a loss. For example, in Cape Town, the average subsidy of a public transport trip that you take on maybe the My City bus or the train, on average, the subsidy that the government pays is 19 Rand per ticket or per trip that you take. Whereas on a taxi, the government subsidizes maybe around 1 Rand at most. It's very clear that we need to upgrade our taxi industry rather than competing against them with other solutions which might work. I'm not saying that they're not going to work, but the taxi industry has really grown naturally to meet the needs of the African context. And minibus taxis are prevalent throughout Africa. But anyway, that's not the main focus of my presentation. The main focus is, how do we test an idea, like to have these ideas floating in our mind about the future transport system? How do we test which is the best? Well, here's my big idea. Take it as a grain of salt. There's many ideas that could be better than this, but we're going to test this one big idea which I personally feel would be absolutely amazing for our country and for Africa. Are you ready? Electric minibus taxis. Africa's homegrown public transport system, but now with batteries. Now, I know I can hear you screaming your pants off already. What about Eskom? Can they cope with thousands of electric taxis? Or any electric vehicles for that matter? Well, I don't know. That's where I'll be presenting a method today to try and figure that out. But I do know that if this does work out, fares will be cheaper, public transport will be more accessible, and hence traffic would be reduced, and the environment would be much greener. Once again, we could actually breathe in the wonderful place which we call home, Africa. So that's where my research steps in. What we did is, to test this brilliant hypothesis that I have, is we started off by tracking 10 taxis in Stellenbosch. So basically, my supervisor went to 10 taxi owners in Stellenbosch and basically bribed them to install GPS trackers into their vehicles, just so that my supervisor could see how the taxis moved and when they stopped and so forth. So they tracked these vehicles for a period of 2 years. And so we had this massive amount of data. And yeah, when I started my master's at the beginning of last year, I proposed, why don't we use this data to figure out if electric vehicles, if these taxis could be made electric and how much electricity they would use, based on this data. So this is the first step of the whole analysis of forecasting the electric energy consumption of any fleet that you might be interested in calculating, whether it be a fleet of delivery vans, fleet of buses, whatever vehicles. First step is to track or get data on how they move and how they stop. There are other approaches besides using GPS trackers, like, for example, if you're trying to forecast the amount of energy of private vehicles in general, you could use the common tracker that we all have in our pockets, cell phones. Basically, if you have access to the cell phone network, you could figure out how the traffic flows are. If you own the fleet, you can install trackers pretty easily. You don't have to bribe anyone. And yeah, there's various other approaches, surveys, etc. So first step, track the data, get the data. Now, the next step is to explore the data and see what findings you can get from that, or what hypotheses, whether you can hypothesize anything. So I developed a software which walks you through these steps that I'm about to describe. And so, yeah, like I said, the next step is to analyze the data that you've tracked. So with our taxis, we had all these GPS traces, and this is, for example, an animation of how one of the taxis in Kampala, another city which we tracked, how the taxi moves through the city on one of its trips. And you can see that line moving through the road network and arriving at its destination eventually. So we can look at how these taxis move based on the data. Then let's see if we can find anything else that's interesting. So with the Stellenbosch taxis that we were tracking, these taxis, we first generated a heat map of where these taxis tend to be located. So based on their GPS traces, where they typically drive more often versus the places where they don't drive often. So if you see here, the red zones are areas of more activity that the vehicles of the fleet had, and yellow, green, blue would be less activity. So this vehicle in particular, this taxi in particular, had a lot of activity here in Cape Town and a lot here in Eastern Cape. So by analyzing those animations that I showed in the previous slide, that we could see that these taxis used to take long distance trips on the weekends to the Eastern Cape, and during the weekdays they would operate in Cape Town or in Stellenbosch to be specific. So if we zoom into this region over here, we can see the area that the taxis typically operate. So this is Stellenbosch, Cape Town area. So just to go back, we zoomed into this part of the map because we didn't want to analyze the electric consumption of these long distance trips. We want to do, at least for now, just focus on the short distance trips, the daily workday commute that these taxis make. So this is the third step of the process, filtering out the data that you've tracked, to filter it out and to just leave yourself with the data that's important. So as I've shown here, we cropped out all the other data and we just kept the data in this region of study. And as you can see, there's 3 main regions where the taxis operate, and that's here Stellenbosch, Brackenfell, Somerset West. If you're not from Cape Town, don't worry, it's just nearby suburbs. And yeah, so we had this data. Now, the next step was to see how long they stop, where they stop, when they stop, and how long they stop. So just analyzing this data that we've filtered out the data that we need, and now we're just going to analyze it and see what the characteristics are of this data, how the vehicle's mobility patterns are, in other words. So in this image, we've zoomed into Stellenbosch and we can see a few colorful dots there. So those are the places where my software identified the places where this taxi typically stops. So these are very good candidate optimum sites for installing charging stations. Yeah, charging stations for the vehicles to top up their batteries as they go along their daily commute. And during this process, we also extracted the typical times, the length of time that the taxis stopped at these locations. So in a case of, say, delivery vans, they might stop at their depot, and this algorithm would figure out how long they typically stop and which depots or which locations they typically stop at. And this can provide information on where and how long the vehicles can charge for. Okay, so I'm going to skip through a few slides. Okay, so yeah, basically based on this data analysis, we found that the average taxi drove 230 kilometers in a day, and that's around 500 Rand of petrol per day, which is quite a lot of money for a taxi driver. And with petrol prices on the rise, it's not getting any better. So let's see if we can beat this with electric vehicles, beat this price. But before we do that, another thing that we noticed was with the stop analysis, we found that taxis typically stop around 8 to 11 hours of chargeable stop time in a day. So like if they stopped for greater than 20 minutes, we would consider that as chargeable stop time. And these are the times that they would get an opportunity to charge. So around 8 to 11 hours. Now we took these GPS traces, which we've tracked and filtered, and the next step was to generate routes. So now a typical GPS trace won't have data points sometimes it will be a data point every 100 meters, sometimes every 200 meters, or maybe if you're lucky, it could be every 10 meters or so. But the distance between data points varies. So the next step is, in order to simulate these GPS traces as electric vehicles, we now need to generate routes which link the various data points to one another. So for example, let's say these X marks in this map, if those are GPS data points, you need an algorithm which can read a network of roads, like from a map, and generate the routes that link the various data points to one another. Then what we're going to do in the following step is to create an electric vehicle model which follows these routes, but follows them with an electric drive, and it will report on how much energy, how much power it used, how much energy it used throughout its trips. So that's our objective. Okay, so let me go back to my previous slide. So we generated these routes, and then we initialized an electric vehicle model, choosing the various parameters, such as the motor size, the weight of the vehicle, the surface area, drag coefficients. There's a few parameters that you would play around with. And once you're happy with the model and once you verified the routes, you can simulate. And this is how the simulation looks like. So here you can see the taxi. It's the blue triangle over there on the left-hand side. And it's going through this road network. And on the right-hand side, you can see the speed, acceleration, and power profiles as the vehicle is moving. So yeah, that's the vehicle moving, and it's recording data which gets saved into a database. And after this simulation, after we've simulated all 10 taxis for all 2 years of routes, then we'll have this massive data set filled with a lot of data of how much electricity they used on each of these different days. And we will then need to process this massive amount of data to get some meaningful results. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you some meaningful results that we got from this simulation, and hopefully you'll be able to run the same analysis on your own. You might come across some own analyses that you would like to do, which you could use the software, or maybe you could just use these results for something interesting. So this is the mean amount of electricity that these taxis used on their daily commute. So that's 230 kilowatt hours of electricity. If that doesn't sit well with you, that's around 400 Rand of electricity. So previously petrol vehicles were using 500 Rand, now it's 400 Rand. And so the savings is only around 100 Rand. But over 15 years, that would save the taxi owner roughly 400,000 Rand. So that's something. But we will need to find some way to sweeten the deal further if possible. So let's look at the results in more detail to see if we can find anything more interesting. So this is the velocity profile of those taxis on a typical day. So each day had its own velocity profile for each of the taxis. So we calculated the mean of all the velocity profiles to get this velocity profile. And you can see that there's two main peaks of activity. So we can see a huge peak of activity in the morning from around 6 to 9 a.m., which corresponds to the morning rush of everyone trying to get to work. And also in the evening or afternoon, where people are returning back from work. But if you look carefully there, around midday, there's definitely a distinct dip in activity as the taxis basically sit around in the taxi rank. So now this was the velocity profile. What we wanted to know is the power profile. So this is how much power they use throughout the day for a typical vehicle. And it corresponds very similar to the velocity profile. And we can see around 25 kilowatts on average across all the taxis on a typical day in the morning. So that's the power usage profile. And it's very similar to the typical profiles of many other services that we use, like electricity in general. We typically use a lot of electricity in the mornings and evenings from the electric network. But luckily, with vehicles, since they have batteries, the time when they will be loading the grid is during the times of reduced activity, which is here in midday and here in the early morning hours of the night. So those are times when the grid is a bit less burdened. So that's good news, at least. So we repeated this. So these are the results, the kind of results we're getting. So we decided, let's reuse the software for taxis again, but not just in South Africa, not just in one city, but let's try and simulate whole cities of public transport across Africa. We were lucky to get data from Google, or not really from Google, but we used the Google Transit feed data, which was publicly available. And we simulated 7 cities across Africa, and these are some of the results that we found. So here you can see 4 cities, Harare, Kampala, Nairobi, and Freetown. And here are their power profiles for each of them. As you can see, some of them, they have a very similar power profile to the Stellenbosch dataset in that they also have that morning and evening peak of activity. So if we look at Harare, for example, they use approximately 3 gigawatt hours of energy in total. So this is the total energy consumption of their whole public transport fleet. And that's around maybe 10%. Well, okay, in South Africa, we produce around 500 gigawatt hours per day of electricity. So this is 3 gigawatt hours. I don't know how much percent that is. That's like point something percent of our daily energy generation. So yeah, that's how much electricity their taxis would use in Harare. And the power consumption of the fleet goes up to 200 megawatt hours, but this is power drawn from the batteries, not from the grid. And so, yeah, we can see similar results from the other 4 cities. However, for Kampala, we found that it looks like that there's no evening peak, but in actual fact, we found out that was an error in the people who collected the data, because they were not working after work hours. And in fact, Kampala does have an evening peak based on other data which we collected. Kampala has an evening peak of activity as well. So we were able to extend this simulator, which was originally designed just for a small fleet of vehicles, and now we were able to simulate whole cities of up to 50,000 minibus taxis in each of these cities, depending on the modal share that those cities use. So as you can see, they all have a midday dip in energy. So using the results of the simulator, we could see that, okay, there's this midday dip, which means that taxis can charge during the midday. And not only that, these taxis could maybe use solar power to charge, solar charging stations to charge during the midday, because that's when the solar profile is at a peak. So let's look at a typical solar profile. So this is the profile of solar energy per square meter during various hours of the day. So at around 11 a.m., solar panel would generate approximately 100 watts per square meter in Stellenbosch. This profile was for Stellenbosch. And this is the average across the year. Obviously, it would be lower in winter months and higher in summer months. But the key point is that the profile is at a highest at around 11 a.m. So if a taxi had to stop at certain times during the day, then all we need to do is we need to integrate this irradiance curve, apply some efficiency constants, and then we can get the total amount of solar energy that can be extracted during those stops per square meter of solar panel. So we did just that, and here are the results. So of course, for the various months of the year, like during the winter months, the energy generated would be less. So during the winter months, we found approximately 0.6 kilowatt hours per square meter. And in the summer months, we were generating around 1.4 kilowatt hours per square meter. So this is the total amount of PV that can be generated. And this is how much the minibus taxis can extract directly from PV based on when they stop. So they typically stop during the sunlight hours. So they use quite a significant portion of the total generated solar energy. The rest, so if you compare these two graphs, the minibus taxis can use approximately 50 to 70% of the generated solar energy. So that's just from stopping at the right time. So without storing the excess solar energy or anything, minibus taxis, they just plug in, they can get around 50 to 70% of the generated solar energy. So the remaining excess solar energy could be perhaps sold to the grid to alleviate the load on the grid, and maybe it can be stored in stationary batteries or something, but that's another problem to solve. There's a lot of complexities around that, but it's looking quite promising. So let's see how this works out. Like how much, based on this, how much solar panel area would we need to meet a taxi's total energy demand? So like I said previously, a typical taxi, 350 square meters of solar panel to completely meet the energy demands of one taxi. Let me break that down for you. That's half a tennis court of solar panels required to meet the full energy demands of a taxi. That's around a 1.5 million Rand investment at the moment. And that would run a taxi for free for 25 years at no cost to the environment. And the good news doesn't stop there. Like, these costs would get lower and lower as renewable energy technology improves. And the petrol prices are just going higher and higher. By the way, the equivalent petrol price of running in a taxi for 25 years is 3.5 million rand. So 2 million rand more expensive. So the only financial barrier that's left remaining is the actual cost of the minibus taxi. That's the remaining cost. So the average cost of a minibus taxi, okay, not the average, a typical thumbsuck cost of an electric taxi would be around 1 million rand, based on the price, the equivalent price in pounds or dollars in developed countries. So around 1 million rand, but of course we would have to import those vehicles, which would make them cost maybe double the price, say 1.5 or 2 million rand. So definitely not feasible. So in order to make this possible, we definitely need to, first of all, produce electric vehicles or electric taxis locally. And so, yeah, at the end of this journey of simulating these taxis with various energy sources and from various cities across Africa, we were left with this awesome piece of software which can simulate electric vehicles from small fleets as well as massive fleets of up to 50,000 vehicles. The only thing is you need to collect the data. And as I said previously, there's many ways of doing that. And we can get statistics and plots and results which really show that there are other possibilities out there, like solar energy or whatever other possibilities might come up from the results of the simulation. So I have a vision for minibus taxis. I envision the taxi of the future charging from cheap electricity overnight during the off-peak hours of the grid, using that energy to do its morning trips, stopping at midday to charge from renewable energy with solar panels that are perhaps owned by the taxi association itself, and using that clean energy to do its evening trips, and returning home once again to charge from the grid, or maybe even to provide excess energy back into the grid. So a lot of complexities around that, about feeding energy from the batteries into the grid to help support the grid, and using renewable energy electricity to support the grid. Yeah, there's a lot of complexities about that, which needs to be investigated further, but yeah, definitely something to look at in the future. So yeah, as you can see, the software allows us to imagine and dream of new opportunities which didn't exist before. And yeah, you can use it for practically any fleet of vehicles, delivery vans, Ubers, rickshaws. So yeah, I have a dream. I dream of transport that is more affordable now and in the future. I dream of transport that respects nature and is inspired by it. Renewable energy is like a flower. It blooms when the sun is out, and when it dies, it leaves behind seeds for future generations. To take from a Xhosa proverb, akho nkanga idubula ingeti. There's no flower which doesn't bloom before it dies. Renewable energy will bloom in our generation. Labor is always necessary to yield the first harvest, but let us sow the seeds now so that it can bloom and release more seeds for future generations. Thank you. But before I take questions, I just want to express my acknowledgements to MTN South Africa and Eskom for funding this research. And I'd like to thank my supervisors who helped me and had a lot of trust in me. And above all, I thank God. Please follow me on ResearchGate, the first link there, if you are interested in future research. And my research paper, which accompanies this presentation, is found on the second link. And this link is the link to the software, which is available for free and is open source. So you can modify it as you wish. And yeah, you can do there's a lot of documentation which I've written, and there's another student who's joined me in maintaining the software. So yeah, the software works, and we're willing to support you and help you with that. It's actually mutually beneficial because we learn of the various bugs and issues that are present in the software while you get to use the software for your needs. So thank you. I hope there's questions. I hope my research was controversial, but also inspiring. And yeah, please post any questions you have in the chat, or actually just unmute yourself and please ask any questions.
Okay. Chris, thank you very much. We're getting a lot of good comment in the chat box right now. Mike Barker says he has lots of questions, but I'd like to slip one in early on, if I may. Did your model, I mean, the idea of taking these transport paths and then putting an EV model onto them is just a really great way to, to represent the reality of travel. And I guess that principle can be taken to other climes as well. Just a thought I had, did you take elevation and regenerative braking into account in your modeling?
Okay, yes, definitely. We definitely included regenerative braking as part of the model. Unfortunately, the network, the GPS technology that we have today, or at least the GPS data which we have today that's publicly available, doesn't have reliable elevation information. So we couldn't simulate that, but it's definitely possible if you have the data. But yeah, basically we just regenerated energy when the vehicles were braking. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess a lot of these things would effectively be averaged out less the efficiency.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Colleagues, any other questions for Chris?
Hi, Chris. It's Vasu here. I just wanted to check, you didn't look at the option of having panels on the roof of the taxi, yeah?
It was, of course, an option, but it's definitely an option. But the first thing was to see how much energy these taxis would use,
Yeah.
and how much solar energy would be generated per square meter. So, like I said previously, you would need half a tennis court of solar panels to meet a taxi's daily energy demands. So yeah, the roof of a taxi, I don't know, I approximate maybe it's 2 square meters or something of solar panel area. So yeah, it would definitely contribute, but of course it wouldn't meet the full energy demands. But yes, I haven't really looked into it in detail, but certainly it would help.
Okay, and then the next one was the change in driving style. Obviously, when you're driving an electric vehicle, did you look at that, or you just assumed that the driving style would remain the same, for regeneration of power or generation of power?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we used the data that we had. So we used the same routes, but the velocities along those routes were changed based on the electric vehicle model. So these vehicles might not have driven as fast as petrol vehicles, or maybe they would have driven more smoothly or something like that based on the limitations or maybe the freedoms that are given by electric vehicles. So yeah, not the driving style per se, but yeah, the dynamics were changed a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mike, you said lots of questions. Have you got something specific from your side, Mike Barker?
Yes, Marcus, I was just giving everybody else a chance because I'm now going to take over here. Chris, incredible presentation. I'm so glad to hear that there's people passionate about e-mobility. I've been looking at taxis for quite a while, so I'd like to engage with you later on. We've just put together a microgrid simulation of Megawatt Park, showing how a number of electric vehicles using vehicle to building to grid technology could support Megawatt Park, because there's load shedding evidently. Just quickly, a taxi 210 kilowatt hours per day. What sort of distance did you assume that taxi was traveling?
Well, it was taken directly from the routes that we calculated, that we captured. So it's based on the data that we that the taxis, the actual routes that they traveled in each day.
Okay.
So the average distance was, what did I say previously? I think 230 kilometers or so. So that's the average distance, but we calculate the energy consumption from the routes themselves.
Yeah. No, that's excellent data, and maybe we should use that as a benchmark set of data if it's possible to make it available via the load research group. If you got hold of Marcus, he could maybe post it somewhere. And the reason is that everybody, I think, is using different data. Are you aware of the system available over at NREL? They've done a lot of work on electric buses using Google KML files and that to set out the route, including stopping, starting at robots and things like that.
Did you say at NREL in
NREL.
in America?
Yes, Colorado area, yeah.
I haven't seen this project in particular, but I'm using a lot of NREL's technology in these simulations, actually. So I should look into that.
Yeah, they've got a giant spreadsheet. I'll happily point you towards that. When we last spoke to them, they seem to be very keen, and it would be quite possible for us to work with them as well. Okay, apart from taxis, have you had a look at the larger buses?
No, I've been trying to get into contact with Golden Arrow. They recently released their own electric bus. That's been very difficult. We've recently gotten contacted by Woolworths just last week. They heard about our research and they want us to simulate their delivery vans, and they want to convert them to electric. So yeah, that's the next big project. But no, not big buses, not yet.
Sure. Okay. Marcus, I think I'll hand it back to you in case there's anybody else at this stage. But Chris, yeah, I'd love to talk further with you about this. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, the vehicle to grid things are very important, close to my heart as well. So
yeah, that's the big thing. So there's an animal called the grid interactive efficient building, and vehicle to building to grid technology will really make that fly. And so we're using a software called DIRCAM from Lawrence Berkeley, and it does some amazing modeling, looking at vehicle to building to grid, because we believe the buildings are the natural home of the electric vehicle. But thank you. Thanks a lot. Marcus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Paul Tucson. Paul, I see you've got your hand up. Do you have a question?
It's not a question, it's just a comment. I've been reading some stuff on transport costs, and for many poor people, transport costs are half of their salaries. So we've finally, strangely enough, we've just submitted a tender on a similar topic, but I'll talk about that later. But one of my ideas was to somehow put utility scale solar PV in, say, the Uppington area, although I know from the GCCA report there's a transmission constraint out of the Uppington area, and then somehow subsidize the Eskom and City Power wheeling charges, so that the electricity that gets to the charging stations is basically free. And then the taxis could then use free electricity, in inverted commas, free electricity, which would then, subsidize transport for the poor. And then one could also look at, the taking away for taxis, taking away the import, either manufacture locally or take away the import duties, and also import duties for the charges for the taxis, which would make the costs even lower, so that the transport for the poor could actually be, very, very affordable, which would probably be a good socio-economic thing. So it's a very interesting presentation. Well done.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, I 100% agree. Like I said previously, the average subsidy that a person gets when they take a taxi is less than R1 in Cape Town, which is quite surprising compared to like all the other transport. I mean, the poor don't really use the MyCity bus, for example, but there's a huge subsidy behind that. Yeah, so taxis are very well suited for our. But anyway.
Yeah, there's something very interesting happening with transport costs, I guess in the last year or two, with the partial collapse of Prasa. It looks like transport costs are rising substantially, and it might even be a factor of 5 for some of the poorest because these folks are now out of options as to transport services. So the situation is quite dire. It'd be great if something could be done about it. Colleagues, any further questions? So Paul, yes, definitely. Generation elsewhere and wheeling to charging stations sounds like the right kind of thing to be thinking about.
Yes.
Mike, go ahead, Paul or Mike.
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly, Marcus. Chris, what about hydrogen? We keep hearing about hydrogen. I've done a little bit of work on hydrogen, and I can maybe share some of the data with you, but what do you think of hydrogen?
Oh, thanks for asking that. Actually, my PhD next year is going to be on hydrogen, basically the same topic, but seeing the opportunities for hydrogen in electric taxis and electric vehicles in general in Africa. And I can't give a very informed opinion at the moment because I still need to do further studies. But as I see it, there's quite a lot of potential. There's definitely been a buzz and a lot of funding from the government into hydrogen research in South Africa. And I suppose with hydrogen vehicles, we can also look at it maybe makes local production of electric vehicles more feasible because producing batteries is a bit of a difficult thing for our country. So it looks like we're a bit better suited for hydrogen production. I may be mistaken though. And the other thing is, of course, improved mileage and all of those kind of things helping the adoption of more efficient technology.
Yeah. Okay. Just as a matter of interest, and I'd like to get your opinion on these numbers, we put together a small model also using NREL data for hydrogen. And we looked at a green hydrogen refueling station at Cato Ridge. I don't know if you know where that is. And the idea was it's just outside Durban. It would refuel vehicles, articulated trucks running up to the reef. So we figured you need 70 kgs of hydrogen to get them up Van Renen through to Joburg. So for 100 vehicles at 70 kgs of green hydrogen each to refuel them 365 days a year, you would need 66 hectares of photovoltaic solar farm.
I don't see a problem.
So I'm very impressed. I mean, looking at your 350 square meters to fuel one taxi a day, I'd love to be able to compare some numbers on the hydrogen side. But remember, that's a heavy vehicle, 18-wheeler truck.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. But thanks a lot. Great presentation.
Thank you. Paul, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I found out for the first time, just shows how one can go through life being so ignorant, but I found out the other day that out of the 6,000 minibus taxis in Joburg, 1,300 are on gas. And the cost of gas works out to be about, what's the price of petrol these days? It's half. Anyway, it works out to be half the cost per litre compared with petrol and diesel. Have you factored in some sort of transition or thought about the whole gas story for minibus taxis and vehicles?
Wow, this is news for me as well. I mean, you said 6,000 taxis in Joburg use gas?
No.
1,300 out of the 6,000 are currently on gas. And apparently the cost of the conversion is 30,000 Rand per taxi. And that initial conversion was paid for by the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation. And it's just interesting. And the gas is Egoli gas, which eventually comes from Sasol and Tamani, the Mozambique gas. It's just interesting to me why IDC just put the brakes on after 1,300 and didn't go, to the full 6,000, because apparently the taxi guys are hammering on associations are hammering on the doors to get access to this 30,000 Rand, because if they can half their fuel costs, then you don't have to be a Einstein to realize that that'll be it's of benefit to them. So you haven't. Sounds like you hadn't heard of it either, which is quite comforting because I didn't know about it either. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's stunning news. I'm definitely going to look into that.
Yeah, it was an item in the news recently. Thanks, Paul. Is that it from your side?
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep thinking. Just a matter of interest, there's a time and a place for everything. I know Mike is working on these things kind of all the time, and it's driven by our expectation of the future. And I see in engineering news, since the 15th of November, we have 2 articles here about appointing the MEC of Gauteng roads infrastructure, appointing a team to look at EVs, green transport deployment in Gauteng government. So that's the whole government fleet looking at conversion to green transport. That was 15th of November. And if we go down a bit more, DTIC to submit EV policy to cabinet before the end of the year. So that's electric vehicle policy in South Africa, and DTIC getting behind it. So this is a technology, an evaluation technology whose time has come, I think, Chris, from your side. I wouldn't be surprised if you get a lot more requests for help. Colleagues, any further questions for Chris? I have one from Karen. It says it really makes sense to encourage local manufacture. We have the capability and need the job opportunities. And certainly that is so. I know that TTI was looking at local manufacture of batteries, and they have a couple of programs up. One just hopes that these kind of things take off, because we have the rare earth metals and so on, and obviously there's no shortage of platinum and so on for the green hydrogen stuff. Paul, is your hand up, or do you have or is that an old hand?
Did any of you guys present that Chris Yelland talk on hydrogen? Must have been a month ago, where he had the Toyota chief executive and he had De Ruyter and a few other quite senior personages. And it sounded like Toyota was quite advanced with the hydrogen aspect. And he is the CEO of Toyota South Africa. So one would think that they are thinking quite strongly on, with South Africa having lots of sun and etc., that, the local manufacturer has entered into their vision from an EV point of view, from a charger point of view, and from a hydrogen point of view. I don't know if any of you attended that Chris Yelland hydrogen thing recently.
I did not. Mike, were you there? Anyone else in the audience?
Yeah, Paul, it was pretty interesting because a little while later they had Sasol announcing the Energy Council of South Africa, which is all the fossil fuel guys. And there again, they made a big play on the hydrogen side of things. So I think we're going to see a lot of gas coming from Sasol, which would be grey hydrogen, because
Yes.
they'd be converting it. Yeah, Toyota seemed to have a particular mindset that favors hydrogen. BMW did drop it, as far as I know. Yeah, Chris, you're probably going to be in the thick of things, so hopefully you'll be presenting again in a year's time about your hydrogen work, right?
Yes, certainly. I'll be doing my first 6 months in Germany. I'm with a professor called Thorsten Zenner. Yeah, he's very knowledgeable, so I'm really looking forward to exploring this topic.
Oh, that's fantastic. Colleagues, I think we're kind of approaching the end now. If there are any final questions or closing comments from you, if you can land them now. Okay, I've got nothing. Chris, once again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out to educate and entertain us. This has been a very nice bit of work to have a look at, and it does open one's eyes for, as I said, transferable stuff into the future, technologies for evaluation. It's really an eye-opener, and we really appreciate you taking the time. And I would like to propose that we invite you back at some stage in the future to see what has become of this. So from my side, thank you very much, and please look out for that re-invite.
Okay, certainly. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you for everyone for listening and being a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much again. Colleagues, we are now at the end of our agenda. Corin, anything else from your side procedurally before closing?
Nothing. I just wanted to also thank Chris. I think it's very lively discussion. So it just shows you it's worth sharing these topics and studies in this kind of platform. So thank you very much.